Chapter 17, Part 3. I asked Ricky, in what capacity did your dad work for him? Ricky, as a shoe shiner. The 50s was a hard decade for my family. They had nothing. My parents lived in what could only be described as a slum today. He was out of work, depressed, and unable to feed the family. He met Ernie one day in the park. Ernie could see he was desperate, maybe even suicidal at that time. He shut up shop for the afternoon and took my father for a hot meal and a chat. Had they not met, I dread to think what would have happened to him. For the next couple of weeks after that, Ernie insisted my father meet up with him at a set time each day in the park. Whatever he said to him, whatever he did, worked. I suspect Ernie did that just to give him a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to keep going. My mother told me that Dad found a new determination and desire in life after speaking with Ernie. He sought out and found work wherever he could get it, just to get enough money to support the family. No job was considered too menial. His family came first before his pride. After Dad had been trying so hard for some time, Ernie put forward a proposal to him. He met up with my dad one afternoon in the park and presented him with a T-shirt with the words "Incredible Feet" printed on the front. At this point, Ernie's shoeshine business was booming. Both he and Robbie had more work than they could possibly cope with. He was offering my father a job. To say Dad was thrilled would be an understatement. Within a couple of months, he was bringing in a handsome wage, and my family had a lifestyle that they could only have dreamt of weeks before. It was Robbie who first suggested the franchise idea. The Incredible Feet name and logo, a smiling shoe, was very well known and was attracting a lot of attention. He suggested my dad set up shop a few blocks down and simply give back 10% of everything he made. He could keep the other 90% for himself, as long as he bought his own equipment from his earnings. He also had to promise that he would serve with a smile and promote and defend the brand. It was a no-brainer. My dad set up on the corner of East 21st Street and never looked back. When I reached my teenage years, we were living in a fine townhouse, in a nice area with no money worries. We were a very happy family, and we didn't have anything to worry about. Dad would make more in tips than he would in wages. Without Ernie, things would have been so different for the family. I asked him, so Ernie and Robbie had staff? Ricky smiled. First there was my dad, then my older brother. The same deal for him. He worked a few blocks away from my dad, and he wore the T-shirt with pride. He was such a happy soul, perfect for Incredible Feet. The money was pouring in, but this was never about the money. It was about self-esteem and self-worth. Nobody ever let it go to their head, and nobody ever took advantage of or tried to scam Ernie and Robbie. These little franchises cropped up all over the place. The boys never advertised for staff. They went out and looked for who they thought would needed help and who would benefit from being part of their enterprise. They even had to convince some people to join them. They targeted the homeless or those struggling with life's challenges. Age was irrelevant, colour was irrelevant, religious background was irrelevant. All that was important was the person and the personality. If they needed money to get them started, the boys would provide it. If they needed help or support, the boys would provide it. The Incredible Feet family grew to over 250 around the city. 250, I said, all working for Ernie and Robbie? Working for themselves, really, Ricky said. But Ernie and Robbie also got 10% of everything they earned, as they were still making themselves in the original spot in the park. They still kept on working. They were actually living and working. They were the living and working face of the business. They were an inspiration and role models for the others. They must have been rich, I said. Deborah interrupted. They certainly could have been. They were all earning a small fortune, enough to make them very wealthy men indeed. To be honest, it reached a point where they didn't need to work forever. They could have lived off the franchises and been very comfortable with it. So why didn't they? I asked. Because they didn't keep the money. They kept enough to live on, but they gave the rest away. Who to? I asked. Whoever needed it, she said. Charities, children's homes, schools, collections for the police, the fire service, the doctors and nurses, the medical staff. They would look for where the money was needed most at any one time. They didn't advertise what they were doing, but everyone knew. The whole community knew. It wasn't long before the press found out too, but Ernie insisted they leave that angle out of the story. It was nobody else's business but theirs. And then there was the attack on Robbie. The murder? I believe it was linked to the mafia, I said. The Gambino family. Ricky. They never admitted to it, but everyone knew who was responsible. The Gambinos had a fearsome reputation in the 50s and 60s. Nobody messed with them. There were many unsolved crimes, murders, assaults, arson, many linked to mob families, but few arrests were ever made. They used to run protection rackets across the city. You know the kind. Pay us 20% each week and your shop will be safe. It didn't take them long to see how successful Incredible Feet was becoming. They weren't interested in community or the charity work associated with the business. They only saw it as another avenue to exploit, another opportunity to amass the bucks. They started putting the squeeze on Ernie and Robbie, but the boys wouldn't pay them a cent. Early on it was nothing more than threats, but then one day a couple of men gave Ernie quite a beating. He was hospitalized, and the business was shut for a few days. It shocked and angered the community. When Ernie came back to work, still bruised and in pain, he was given a hero's welcome. But the threats and intimidation continued. Ernie and Robbie still refused to pay out, and then they singled out Robbie. One evening he was dragged off the main street and down into a back alley when he was walking home. It was clear from the injuries he sustained that they had no intention of leaving him alive. It sent shockwaves through the community, because Robbie was one of the pillars of this community. He was an idol to many. He had never harmed or hurt a soul in his life, and there he was, lifeless and cold in some back alley. Deborah continued. It was huge news at the time. It was on the radio and it was in the papers, but the culprits were never identified or found. Ernie took the news particularly hard, as you would expect. Robbie was his best friend. I think the Gambinos underestimated the strength of feeling in the neighbourhood. They soon became hated by everyone. They prided themselves on respect, but they'd lost any respect they once had in this community. People boycotted their clubs, casinos, their bars. No one would cover for them or back them. They still had the power and the position, but they'd lost the respect, and that hurt them. Incredible Feet continued through its franchise workers, but the prime spot, the two red chairs in the middle of Madison Square Park, remained empty for over a month. Nobody touched them. Nobody interfered. And then, one morning, without any fanfare, Ernie returned to polish shoes. Word spread like wildfire, and soon the queues were around the block again. The Gambinos never bothered him or any of his workers ever again. A bittersweet triumph for Ernie and Robbie. Rumour has it Carlo Gambini, the head of the family, came to the park one day and offered to polish Ernie's shoes as way of an apology. But Ernie refused. Well, that's the rumour. There were a lot of rumours. Ricky continued. It is certainly part of New York folklore, though. It is stories like that and the whole fairy tale of Incredible Feet that brings the celebrities flocking, especially those of the black community. Out of the 250-odd franchise workers, over 200 were black. Ernie and Robbie didn't discriminate. Those men and women must have been the ones who needed the most help, but it highlights the inequalities between the races back then just as now. Come with me. I want to show you something. Ricky stood up. Instinctively, the three of us picked up our tumblers. Wherever he was taking us, we weren't going to go there without a drink. We followed him back downstairs and through the bar. Max called to his mum asking for help, but he was ignored. We walked out through the front door, across the road and into the park. It was dark now, and only a few people were going about their business along the winding pathways. Ricky stopped by the side of one of them. There, under a street lamp, were two cast-iron replicas of the shoeshine chairs, and underneath them was an inscription. It read, "Incredible feet were polished here. Incredible people worked here. To Ernie Grimshaw and Robbie McNulty, you continue to shine through us all." Ricky put his hand on my shoulder. "Why don't you come back in the bar and get drunk with us tonight, Paul? We don't want a dime from you, just your company. You might even get a few more stories from the regulars. I can't vouch for their accuracy, of their tales. You can make your own mind up, but I'm sure you'll have a bloody good night." I didn't need to be asked a second time, and that is why I'm sat up with you in bed, Mr. Diary, feeling like I've been struck on the back of the head with a sledgehammer. Once these painkillers kick in, I'm sure I'll pull through. It was worth it, though. Back to England tomorrow. One more lead to follow up here in this great city, and then I'm done. Homeward bound.